I want to speak today about James Madison and Madison's view of democracy. Now, as many of you know, today in America, we sometimes have this kind of semantic or verbal dispute about, is America a democracy? Is America a republic? And very often that argument becomes like two ships passing in the night. You don't get a lot of clarity out of it, because it's not explained in what sense are we a democracy? What kind of a democracy? We're clearly a democracy in some respect. We're a constitutional democracy. We're a democracy that places severe limits on what the government, the elected government, can do. We're a democracy that protects minority rights. As we'll see, Madison is very interested, and in fact, he devised a number of these systems for the US Constitution. But let's begin by noting that when we use the term democracy, we are talking about representative democracy. Representative democracy as contrasted with, well, you'd have to say original democracy. Original democracy was direct democracy, rule by the people. The people themselves show up and rule. Now, admittedly, this was never perfect even in ancient Athens. In the Agora, for example, even though there were about 40,000 citizens in ancient Athens in the 5th century BC, about 8 to 12,000 would show up and actually cast their vote. And of course, the vote was prohibited to women, and there were obviously no votes for slaves. The American founders were very ambivalent about Athenian democracy. In fact, I'm now quoting Madison from the 10th book of the Federalist. He describes democracy as mob rule. He goes, democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. This is not the prose of a admirer. And ancient Athens, even in its glory days, does fit this description. Let's remember, it was the democracy of Athens, by a vote of its leaders, and of course by a jury vote, that put perhaps the greatest philosopher of all time, Socrates, to death. For what? Philosophizing on the streets of Athens. So when we sing the praises of majority rule, and these days we hear a lot about democracy. The Republicans are against democracy. Voter integrity laws are against democracy. But nobody asks, why is democracy a good idea in the first place? Why does the majority have the right to rule? It may seem obvious that it does, but let's think about this. Let's say you have a large country, and it is adjoined by a small country. Do the citizens of the large country, because they are more numerous in number, they're more numerous, do they have the right to rule the citizens of the small country because there are more of them? I think most of us would say no. So why should the majority have a right to rule not just over itself, but over the whole society, making decisions not just for the majority, but for the minority, which is then compelled to conform to it? Let's say, for example, the majority makes rules that discriminate in its own favor and against minorities. Let's just say the majority decides we're going to have a 10% tax rate, but the minority, the other 49%, they're going to have a 90% tax rate. Should the majority be able to do that? Let's say the majority decides to confiscate the property of the minority. Let's take their house. Let's take their yard. Let's take their cars. Should the majority be able to force the minority to build their houses in a certain way, or to pay for everybody's college education, or to purchase healthcare at prices that are set by the majority itself? I mean, I'm giving examples to clarify a point, and some of these examples aren't all that fanciful. They're actual proposals by leftists that, yeah, we can pass laws that do this and do that. We're perfectly happy to force the rest of the citizens to go along with us. And this is supposed to be not just an exhibition of power, but some kind of a moral ideal. Now, in his major discussion of faction, this is from the Federalist Papers, Madison makes it really clear he disapproves of giving the majority this kind of unlimited power. He doesn't think that there is a moral ground just because you're more numerous to tyrannize over everybody else. And in discussing factions, a faction is kind of a power group that is selfishly pushing for itself. Madison says there are really two types of faction. There are majority factions and there are minority factions. So the country's full of minority factions. There are people who want this benefit for themselves and people who want that, and union people want more wages and employers want government subsidies, and this place wants to build a bridge and increase its employment. And so all these people are pushing for things. And Madison is worried about those factions. He's trying to figure out a way to limit their ability to raid the public purse. But he's most worried about majority factions, and for a simple reason. Madison says that a minority faction can always be squelched by the power of a majority. The majority can always vote against, no, you want that bridge? It's a useless bridge, it's a bridge to nowhere, no one's going to cross over it. No, we're not going to fund it. But Madison says, who is going to curtail the power of the majority? So here we have a startling idea from Madison, because when we think of tyranny historically as coming from the British crown. It comes from a monarch. And we think of the people as the solution. We've turned over power from the one to the many, from the ruler to the people. But, says Madison, and but say the American founders agreeing with them, there are in fact two types of tyranny. There's the tyranny of the one, and there's the tyranny of the many. The tyranny of the many, the founders by and large called tyranny of the majority. And the tyranny of the majority, in some ways, is even more terrifying than the tyranny of the one, because first of all, it exerts its power over a larger reach of society. And second, because it has so much backing, it gains a certain kind of moral force. The tyranny seems not only an exertion of power, but an exertion of right. And so what Madison says is we need all kinds of arrangements in America that will check the power of the majority itself, that will check the power of the people. So the American Constitution is simultaneously an expression of the people's will through representative government, but it's also block and tackle mechanisms to slow down, check, and in some cases, totally frustrate. And we're seeing this now in this battle over the infrastructure bill, ways in which the Democrats are really frustrated. They feel that democracy itself isn't working. Well, democracy is working. It's working the way the founders intended. They intended to block and tackle and frustrate you guys. And it's kind of nice to see that even though some of our constitutional mechanisms we've moved away from, others remain in place. And the architect of that, I'll continue to talk about this. And I won't talk about it Monday. Monday is Columbus Day. I'm going to do kind of a special on Columbus. I'm going to do the importance of Columbus. But then I'll pick it up on Tuesday and show how a lot of the block and tackle mechanisms of the Constitution and of our system of government were put in place by one James Madison.